Hi, I am Aurel Enriquez, and this presentation contains our discussion on the respiratory system. The structures of the respiratory system are used to acquire oxygen and remove carbon dioxide in the blood. So, di ba po, nabanggit na natin ito in our previous discussions. Now, oxygen is required to create adenosine triphosphate or yung form of energy na kailangan ng mga cells natin. Now, on the other hand, carbon dioxide or CO2, this is a byproduct of ATP production. So, after po makreate ng adenosine triphosphate, ang byproduct nito or ang waste material dito is yung carbon dioxide. And this must be removed from the blood. So, excessive accumulation of carbon dioxide could lead to negative effects in the body. Listed here are the main structural components of the respiratory system. First, yung point of entry po nung hangin na hinihinga natin, this would enter the external nose. So the nose is basically a chamber for the air that we inhale. Next, pagpasok po nung hangin sa ilong, it would pass through the nasal cavity. In this area, we would have nose hairs that would clean the air. So since mas nasa bandang looban na po yung nasal cavity, this would also warm the air that we breathe in. And also, we have mucous membranes that produce small amounts of fluid in our nasal cavity. So this could also humidify the air that we just inhaled. For some people, they have a problem in their nasal cavity, which is why kailangan pa po nila ng tulong ng mga humidifier, okay? But for normal healthy people with a perfectly healthy nasal cavity, no, we don't need external humidifiers. So our nasal cavity could do that for us. After that, the air that was inhaled would travel to the pharynx. So this is also known as the throat. Alright, and the pharynx is also a common area kung saan pwedeng dumaan both yung air and the food that we ingest. After nung pharynx, air would travel further down into the larynx, which is also called the voice box. Alright, so wag pong kakalimutan yung common names nila. Alright, again, the pharynx is the throat and the larynx is the voice box. So ito po yung segment ng respiratory tract natin that also contributes to our ability to speak by generating our voice. So again, the two main functions of the larynx is for breathing and for voice production. Paglagpas po ng larynx, next is the trachea. The trachea is also known as the windpipe. Alright, again, huwag kakalimutan yung common names. Pharynx is the throat, larynx is the voice box, and the trachea is the windpipe. Of course, sa mga upcoming quizzes, practicals, and exams natin, ang isasagot pa rin po natin is yung mga scientific names nila, okay? Which is the pharynx, larynx, and trachea. Anyway, the trachea, again, this is otherwise known as the windpipe. Alright, so ayan. Kadugtong po nung trachea is yung mga bronchus. Alright, so bronchus, kung isa lang, bronchi if we're talking about the two of them. Alright, so they actually branch from the trachea and then they connect directly to the lungs. Finally, inside of the lungs, there's kind of like a maze or network of tubes where air would pass through. So this network is composed of alveoli, commonly known as the air sacs. Okay, so again, alveoli is otherwise referred to as air sacs. Plus, there are also capillaries within that area. Now, if you remember from our past discussion po, diba, the capillaries are the places where gas exchange could happen. Plus, being in an area where blood could circulate. So, ayan po, there could be, or this could be the place, no, where there would be an exchange between carbon dioxide and oxygen within our blood cells. Alright, now dito po sa discussion natin on the respiratory system, the main site kung saan gas exchange lang talaga yung pakinabang nila, would be the alveoli. Alright, so ulitin natin, sa alveoli po, no, for the most part, puro pag-enter ng oxygen and pag-exit lang ng carbon dioxide yung ginagawa nila dito sa alveoli. Listed here are the segments of the respiratory system. Simula sa nose hanggang sa larynx, that's the upper respiratory tract. Alright, again, from the nose to the larynx, that's the upper respiratory tract. Simula sa trachea hanggang sa mga alveoli, that's the lower respiratory tract. Okay, ulitin natin, from the nose to the larynx, that's the upper respiratory tract. From the trachea to the alveoli, that's the lower respiratory tract. The conducting zone are the places where only ventilation could happen. So sa conducting zone daw po, pagdaan lang po ng hangin yung nangyayari dito. Let's compare that to the respiratory zone. So sa respiratory zone naman po, dito, gas exchange ang ginagawa nila. Alright, so ulitin po natin, conducting zone, passage of air only, no gas exchange. Sa respiratory zone, mostly gas exchange. This slide right here shows us the general structures of the respiratory system. So of course, as we go through our discussion, iisa-isahin din po natin itong mga ito. Let's now go through some definition of terms. Ventilation is the movement of air into and out of the lungs. Alright? So literal na pagdaloy lang po nung hangin. That is ventilation. External respiration is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air in the lungs and the blood. Alright? So let's compare that with internal respiration. Internal respiration, this is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood and the tissues. Okay? So, kung sa external respiration po, yung air and yung lungs yung nagpapalitan ng carbon dioxide and ng oxygen, sa internal respiration po, yung blood and tissues naman po yung nagpapalitan ng oxygen and carbon dioxide. Listed here are the other functions of the respiratory system. Ano pang ibang kayang gawin ng respiratory system aside from exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide? The respiratory system can maintain the pH of the blood by getting rid of the excess carbon dioxide. So first question, ano ba ang normal pH ng blood? Alright, so it's at 7.35 to 7.45, which is slightly alkaline. Ngayon, ano naman po kung tataas yung carbon dioxide in the blood? Now, this could result in hypercapnia or respiratory acidosis. Now, patients with hypercapnia can present with tachycardia, dyspnea, confusion, headaches, and dizziness. So let's define some of those. Tachycardia is a heart rate that is faster than normal or more than 100 beats per minute at rest. Okay, so based on our previous discussion on the cardiovascular system, ano po ang normal heart rate natin? Yep, it's at 72 beats per minute only. All right. Next, dyspnea. So dyspnea, this is a sensation of running out of air and of not being able to breathe fast enough or deeply enough. So in simpler terms, no, just to simplify that statement, nahihirapang huminga. Okay, there is difficulty breathing. So dyspnea, difficulty breathing. Next additional function of the respiratory system is the production of chemical mediators. So the lungs can produce the enzyme ACE or the angiotensin converting enzyme. Ang angiotensin converting enzyme, this also has the capability to regulate blood pressure. Alright? So may enzyme din daw po na pinoproduce yung respiratory system natin na kayang maapektuhan or kontrolin yung cardiovascular system natin, specifically our blood pressure. Next is voice production thanks to the larynx. Alright, so again, ano po ang common name ng larynx? It's the voice box, okay? So, as air moves through the larynx, nasa larynx po kasi yung vocal cords, alright? So, the vocal cords are the muscular tissues that are folded in a V shape. So, dun po sa vocal cords, no, sound is created. Other functions of the respiratory system include olfaction or the ability to smell. So, di ba po, as we inhale, scent particles are also brought in, alright? So, kasama ng hangin. So, the sensory neurons that our nasal cavity would detect and send signals to the brain, alright? So, ulitin po natin, pag inhale natin, may kasama yon na mga scent particles or mga chemical stimuli, alright? So that would reach the olfactory nerves on our nasal cavity and send those signals to our brain. Next is protection. So the respiratory system provides protection against some microorganisms by preventing them from entering the body and removing them from the respiratory surfaces. So yun po yung dahilan, no, kung bakit nose hairs at the entrance of our nasal cavity are present. Alright? Para pag may na-inhale po tayo, no, para pag inhale natin, kung may mga dust particles or pollution, tas kasama dun sa hangin, merong mga infectious organisms, no, at least na-filter muna sila ng mga hair strands present at the nasal passage. So, if ever po may mga microscopic infectious organisms na nakalagpas sa nose hairs natin, ang next level naman po is the mucous membranes of the nasal cavity. So, they're supposed to stick or to be trapped by the moisture or mucus in the nasal cavity. Tapos eventually, i-hatching or isisinga na lang po yung mga particles na yun. Nabanggit na po natin ito kanina on the previous slide. Here are the components of the upper respiratory tract: the external nose, the nasal cavity, the pharynx, and the larynx. Let's go through all of those parts one by one, starting with the external nose. So, the tip of the external nose is mainly composed of hyaline cartilage. Okay, ulitin natin. Yung tip daw po ng external nose natin, ito ay gawa sa hyaline cartilage. Alright? So, which is why it's quite soft and has flexibility. Alright? So, when we die, it would also rot away along with our soft tissues. Alright? So, yung mismong bone po ng skull na makikita po nating nagbibigay ng shape sa nose natin would start at the nose bridge. And then after that, it's just hyaline cartilage. Next is the nasal cavity. So it extends from the nares or the nostrils to the choana or the entrance, yung papunta na sa pharynx. Yung taas naman po, this is called as the hard palate, and yung cartilage dito sa gitna that divides the two holes of the nose is called the nasal septum. Next part of the nose are the paranasal sinuses. So the paranasal sinuses are the openings to the nasal cavity, and this is the place that is lined with mucus. Alright, so if you would remember from our previous discussion, no, yung mga gantong klaseng mucous membranes po, they're considered as the first line of defense and is part of our innate and non-specific immunity. Next is the concave. So the concave, these are the bony projections on each side of the nasal cavity. So sa loob daw po ng nasal cavity, meron parang pader kung saan may mga nakaprotrude na mga bones. Alright, so these protrusions would increase the surface area of the nasal cavity. The greater the surface area means that the air from the outside would have more places or areas in our nasal cavity to make contact with, which would help it in warming up the air from the outside. Last part of the nose is the nasolacrimal ducts, also known as tear duct. So ito daw po yung daanan ng luha and connected din daw po ito sa nasal cavity. Again, that is referred to as the nasolacrimal ducts. Listed here are the functions of the nasal cavity. This would remain open even when the mouth is full of food. Okay, so dalawa po yung pwedeng daanan ng hangin na hinihinga natin, the nose and the mouth. But breathing through the mouth is not really a good practice. Okay, pero ayan nga po, in cases of people who are mouth breathers, no, at least even when their mouth is filled with food, may iba pang pwedeng daanan yung hangin. Next, the nasal cavity could clean the air that we breathe in. This is because of the hairs, which would trap large dust particles and the mucus secretions that could catch the smaller particles. Third function is to humidify and warm the air, which again is a function of the concave. Our nasal cavity is also the area where our olfactory epithelium is located, which again is very important to be able to smell. Next, it helps determine how our voice would sound. So the nasal cavity and the paranasal sinuses are the resonating chambers for speech. So basically, our voice sounds like this because of the way that the air has passed through our nasal cavity and paranasal sinuses, which is why, di ba po, kapag may sakit tayo, halimbawa, meron tayong sipon, nag-iiba rin yung tunog ng boses natin, di ba po? So again, that's one of the reasons because kasama siya sa function ng nasal cavity. Again, the nasal cavity and paranasal sinuses determine the sound of our voice. So again, when we are sick or if, for example, our nasal passages or nasal cavity is blocked, all right, this could affect the sound of our voice. Let's now talk about the next segment of our upper respiratory tract, which is the pharynx. All right, so again, the pharynx is otherwise referred to as the throat, and this is the common passageway for the respiratory and digestive systems. All right, so again, ang pharynx po, pwede siyang daanan both ng air and ng food. So the pharynx is actually divided into three segments or three areas. First up is the nasopharynx. So as the name implies, ang katapat nito is the nasal cavity. So this would take in the air that we inhale. Next is the oropharynx. As you would expect, ang katapat po nito is yung oral cavity. So this extends from the uvula to the epiglottis. Next is the laryngopharynx. So the laryngopharynx would extend from the epiglottis up to the esophagus. Next, what is the uvula? The uvula, this is otherwise referred to as a little grape, which is the extension of the soft palate. So ito po yung pinakilala nating structure that we usually refer to as the tonsil. Diba po? But if you would remember our discussion on the lymphatic system, there are three different types of tonsils, diba? So ayan po. Now, dito, for our discussion on the respiratory system, we will only be mentioning the pharyngeal tonsil. Alright? So, within the pharyngeal tonsil, ayan po, dito natin makikita yung structure na uvula. So, the pharyngeal tonsil, this aids in defending against infections, which again, we've already mentioned that when we discuss the lymphatic system. This illustration right here shows us all the specific structures that we may be able to find within our nasal cavity and our pharynx. So dito pa lang po, nasal cavity and pharynx pa lang, napakarami ng mga specific parts na kailangang aralin. The third component of the upper respiratory tract is the larynx. Again, this is otherwise referred to as the voice box, di ba po? So this is located in the anterior throat that extends from the base of the tongue to the trachea. Alright, so ulitin natin, no, yung area kung nasaan yung larynx, nagsisimula siya sa base or sa ilalim ng tongue hanggang sa trachea. So the larynx consists of 9 cartilages. So ayan po, we have what is known as the thyroid cartilage. Alright, so the thyroid cartilage, this is the largest piece of cartilage that is attached to the larynx. Alright, and this is referred to as the Adam's apple. Alright, so ayan po, in males, this is referred to as the Adam's apple. Now, in females, hindi kasi ganun ka-prominent yung thyroid cartilage, kaya wala siyang specific na name for females. But let's just clarify this, alright? Lahat ng tao, regardless whether you are a male or female, lahat po ng tao, everybody has a thyroid cartilage, okay? So again, everybody, regardless of gender or biological sex, no, everybody has a thyroid cartilage. It's just that it is a bit more prominent in males. So yun po yung na-observe natin na Adam's apple. Alright? So wala tayong nakikita na Adam's apple in females because their thyroid cartilage is not that prominent or not that large, all right? But it is there, it is present, all right? Females also have a thyroid cartilage, but it is not as protruding or as prominent as that of males. So again, the Adam's apple is another term, just another term for the thyroid cartilage. Another part of the larynx is the epiglottis. So this is a piece of cartilage that looks like a flap, all right? So this flap would prevent swallowed materials from entering the larynx. Okay? So ulitin natin, yung unang part bago dumating sa larynx is the pharynx, di ba po? And yung pharynx, it's the common area where both air and food items could pass through. Right? So, ayan po. Again, ang pakinabang po ng epiglottis is to flap and cover, no? To cover the larynx para hindi accidentally may madaan na mga food particles papunta doon sa loob ng larynx, which ang next segment na po is trachea, di ba po? So again, the epiglottis serves as some form of covering to prevent the entrance of food items, no, na nanggaling sa pharynx. This slide right here shows us all the other specific parts and the other types of cartilage that would make up the larynx. Next, hindi pa po tayo tapos sa larynx. Next are the vestibular folds. So the vestibular folds, these are just false vocal cords. Next are the vocal folds. So the vocal folds, these are the actual sources of voice production. Alright, so dito po sa vocal folds, when air moves past them, so kapag dumaan daw po sa vocal folds yung hangin, they would vibrate and then sound is produced. Okay, so again, sound is being produced through the vibration of our vocal folds. They vibrate as air passes through. So the force of the air determines the loudness of our voice. All right, yung puwersa daw po ng hangin, no, this would help us adjust, no, kung gaano kalakas or kung gaano kahina yung boses natin. Now, the tension that we produce on our throat, no, the tension would determine the pitch of our voice or kung gaano katinis or kung gaano kalalim yung boses natin. This slide right here shows us a visual representation kung saan po located yung larynx natin, which again is right here, simula sa base of the tongue. Next, here is an illustration of all these structures that we've talked about earlier, and right here is an actual photo of our larynx through superior view. Let's now go through the parts of the lower respiratory tract, starting with the trachea, and then the bronchi, tracheobronchial tree in the lungs, and then the alveoli. Again, this illustration right here just visually shows us where our upper and lower respiratory tract would be located and kung ano po yung mga components nila. Again, the upper respiratory tract is composed of the nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, and syempre kasama dito yung entrance, which is the external nose. Next, the components of the lower respiratory tract would be the trachea, bronchi, and the lungs. And of course, yung mga alveoli na nandito po sa looban ng lungs. First structure at the lower respiratory tract is the trachea, commonly known as the windpipe. So this is made up of 16 to 20 letter C-shaped rings of cartilage. And those rings are called tracheal rings. Okay, so ulitin po natin, these 20 letter C-shaped cartilage are called tracheal rings. So if we arrange them together, this will create the trachea. Given here are other facts about the trachea. So this is lined with pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Again, if you would rewind to our discussion on tissues and histology, kapag sinabi po natin na pseudostratified columnar, they only look like they are stratified, or they falsely look like they are multiple layers, pero hindi po talaga. They're just varying in sizes, all right, and also the locations of their nucleus, all right. So kumbaga is parang hindi pantay-pantay yung itsura nila, kaya po napapagkamalan sila na stratified. But in general, no, they are columnar, meaning they are cells that are taller in comparison to their width. All right, so ulitin po natin, no, the trachea is lined with cells that are referred to as pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Now, the problem here is that smoking could kill the cilia. Alright, so basically, in Tagalog, pinupudpod or sinisira daw po, no, ng habit of smoking yung hair-like structures sa ibabaw ng pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Next, coughing dislodges materials from the trachea. So, kung halimbawa naman po may foreign materials, foreign particles, or irritating particles na nakadaan sa windpipe natin, then what would happen, the natural reaction of our respiratory system would be to eliminate those or to get rid of those through coughing. This illustration right here shows us the anatomy of the trachea and the lungs, alright? So again, there are different parts right here that has been labeled. Yung nakikita po natin na mga white na guhit-guhit dito, ito po yung mga cartilage or yung mga C-shaped cartilage that would create the trachea. Now, as you can see right here, the air passageway would decrease in size. Notice, no, na in terms of the diameter, no, visually, mas malaki talaga yung daanan ng hangin simula dito sa larynx hanggang sa trachea. But they decrease in size, but increase in number as we go to the inside of the lung. So as we can see right here, no, the passageways would become smaller and smaller, but the branches would continue to divide. Alright, so again, wag din pong kakalimutang aralin yung mga parts and labels na nakikita natin dito. Next up is the bronchi. This is basically an extension of the trachea because it's also made up of the same letter C-shaped cartilage. Pero ito po, it branches into the left and right bronchi that would directly connect to the left and right lungs. Okay, so katulad din po ng trachea, this is also lined with cells that have cilia. This slide right here just lists down the components of the tracheobronchial tree. So nabanggit natin kanina, diba? Structures would become smaller and more numerous from the primary bronchi to the alveoli. So simula sa larynx hanggang trachea, medyo malapad pa po, no? Or malawak pa yung diameter nung passageway for the air. But as we move to the inside of the lungs, mas lumiliit yung passageway, but at the same time, there are more branches. All right, so first up, we have the primary bronchi. So this would be further divided into the lobar or secondary bronchi, the segmental or tertiary bronchi, until eventually it branches off into the tinier bronchioles. All right. After that, we have the terminal bronchioles and then the respiratory bronchioles. So, tuloy-tuloy lang po. Branch lang ng branch hanggang umabot sa alveolar ducts and the alveoli. Okay. So, pagdating po sa alveoli, this is, again, otherwise referred to as the air sacs, where exchange of gas, or gas exchange would actually happen. This slide talks about changes in air passageway diameter. Bronchodilation happens when the smooth muscles around our bronchioles relax, allowing our airways to be larger in diameter. So basically, mas maluwag po yung daanan ng hangin. Bronchoconstriction happens when the smooth muscles around our bronchioles contract, making bronchial diameter smaller. Dito naman daw po sa bronchodilation, imbes na relax, nagko-contract daw po yung smooth muscles sa paligid ng mga bronchioles. So sumisikip din daw po yung daanan ng hangin. Next, what happens during asthma attacks? This is the contraction of the terminal bronchioles, resulting in reduced airflow. So basically, nagbo-bronchoconstriction din po yung mga hinihika, kaya nahihirapan silang huminga. Let's now talk about the alveoli. So the alveoli are the sites for external respiration. Okay, so the alveoli are otherwise referred to as our air sacs. All right, so small air-filled sacs where air and blood would come into close contact, and this is where gas exchange would happen. All right, so our alveoli, they're actually surrounded by capillaries. According to this slide, simula daw po sa terminal bronchioles natin, there are multiple levels of branching. Alright, so this is something that we've always mentioned simula kanina, di ba? Na simula sa larynx and trachea, there is a wide diameter of passageway for the air, pero as we move through, lumiliit yung mga daanan ng hangin, but at the same time, there's continuous branching. So ganun din po dito, there are multiple levels of branching, lalong-lalo na pag simula na or nanggaling na tayo dito sa terminal bronchioles. So first up, we have what is known as the respiratory bronchioles. So they have a few alveoli. Alright, so few alveoli are attached to them. Okay, next we have the alveolar ducts. So they arise from the respiratory bronchioles and open into an alveoli. Okay, so ulitin po natin. Alright, simula sa terminal bronchioles, may respiratory bronchioles. Simula sa respiratory bronchioles, meron ng konting mga alveoli. Pero, if we further go through the branches, simula dito sa respiratory bronchioles, mag-further divide pa ito into alveolar ducts. So dito po nag-open up na siya into other alveoli. Next are the alveolar sacs. So these are the chambers connected to two or more alveoli at the end. Alright, so sa alveolar sacs po dito, ayan nga, medyo mas marami na tayong makikita na mga alveoli dito. So we would understand this better as we look through the illustration on the next slide. This slide shows us all the structures that we've discussed in the previous slides. So again, if for example, this is our terminal bronchiole, this would further divide into the respiratory bronchioles, or these three segments or divisions right here. So itong mga respiratory bronchioles, it has been described that they have a few alveoli attached to them. So may mga paisa-isa na tayo makikita dito. So as you can see right here in this label, right here we're seeing one alveolus. Okay, so kapag isa niya lang alveolus, kapag madami sila, alveoli. Okay, next, the respiratory bronchioles would further branch into the alveolar ducts. So pagdating sa alveolar ducts, tuloy-tuloy na siya hanggang sa alveolar sacs. Alright, so dito sa alveolar sacs, definitely, mas marami na tayong ma-observe na alveoli, as we can see right here in this illustration. And of course, the alveoli are also surrounded with a network of capillaries, as we can see right here in this illustration. So these ones right here are labeled as the pulmonary capillaries. Let's now talk about the respiratory membrane. So the respiratory membrane is found in the lungs, and this is where gas exchange between the air, yung hangin, nakaka-inhale lang natin, and the blood would occur. right? So the respiratory membrane is formed by walls of alveoli and capillaries. Okay, so yung nakita po natin dun sa previous illustration kung saan may mga alveoli na nababalutan ng mga capillaries. Alright, so yun po, we would refer to that area as the respiratory membrane. So alveolar ducts and respiratory bronchioles would also contribute to these activities of exchanging gases. Alright, so ayun po, the respiratory membrane is observed to be very thin for the easy diffusion of gases, which makes sense, di ba po? Kailangan single layer of cells lang, no, yung dadaanan ng gases para madali silang makadaan from one area to another. So kung halimbawa yung oxygen, kailangan madali siyang mag-diffuse or mag-move, no, from the alveoli papunta sa blood circulation. And the other way around, kung may carbon dioxide po na nandoon sa blood circulation, dapat madali lang din para sa kanya to exit the capillaries and move into the alveoli in preparation for exhalation. So again, it makes sense that they are very thin for the easy diffusion of gases. Listed here are the layers of the respiratory membrane. So again, focus po tayo dun sa mga specific layers with highlights. First is the alveolar epithelium. The alveolar epithelium is made up of simple squamous epithelium, which again is only composed of a single layer of cells. Next, it has a thin interstitial space, and next, it has a basement membrane of capillary endothelium. So yung capillary endothelium po, this is also made up of simple squamous epithelium. Alright, so again, tulad po ng nabanggit natin sa previous slides, kailangan talaga single layer of cells lang yung mga pagdadaanan ng mga gases for easy diffusion. This illustration right here shows us the alveolus and the respiratory membrane. So if, for example, nandito po yung airspace, no, within our alveolus, no, ito yung mga areas kung nasaan pwede tayong makakita ng mga capillaries or kung saan pwedeng dumadaan yung mga RBCs. Now, if we were to zoom in further in this area, makikita natin na kung halimbawa ito yung airspace ng alveolus, ito naman po yung respiratory membrane or yung area kung saan mahanap natin yung blood circulation. So again, there's only a simple squamous epithelium between these two structures. Kaya po dapat, ayun, again, dapat simple layer lang sila para madali or easy yung pag-diffuse ng oxygen papunta dun sa RBCs and yung pag-diffuse ng carbon dioxide mula dito sa circulation papunta dun sa alveolus. So kapag yung carbon dioxide po pumunta na dun sa airspace ng alveolus, ready na ito to be exhaled. Alright? So again, if you belong to my laboratory classes, huwag pong kakalimutan na aralin, no, itong mga parts that have been labeled right here. Let's now look at the anatomy of the thoracic wall. It's composed of multiple structures like the thoracic vertebrae, the ribs, the costal cartilages, the sternum, and all the muscles that are attached to these areas na tumutulong para makapag-move yung thoracic wall whenever we breathe in or we breathe out. Alright, so of course, diba, since nag-expand and nag-contract yung lungs natin, pag nag-inhale and nag-exhale tayo, so mahalaga po na meron ding mga associated muscles dito to help with that expansion and contraction of our lungs. The thoracic cavity is a space enclosed by the thoracic wall and diaphragm. So lahat po ng structures na na-enumerate kanina, plus the diaphragm underneath that, this would create the space that is referred to as the thoracic cavity. Alright? So, na-discuss na po natin to when we talked about the muscular system. Di ba po? The diaphragm is a skeletal muscle involved in normal, quiet breathing. Let's now talk about the lungs. So the lungs is the primary organ of respiration. Alright? So marami tayong na-discuss kanina, di ba? Na mga iba't ibang parts, iba't ibang segments that would create our upper and lower respiratory tract. Right? But the main organ that is responsible for our breathing is the lungs. Another description said here is that it is cone shaped. Alright? So medyo pointed yung itaas, tapos mas malapad yung ibaba. Alright? So again, the lungs is somewhat cone shaped. Next, the base rests on the diaphragm. Alright? So yung base daw po, ito yung area that is within contact on top of the diaphragm. Alright? And the apex extends above the clavicle. So yung apex or yung slightly pointed part daw po nung lungs natin, no? So nag-extend daw siya ng medyo mas mataas ng kaunti sa clavicle natin or dun sa collarbone, di ba po? Our clavicle is otherwise referred to as the collarbone. So the right lung has 3 lobes, alright? So kumbaga parang may 3 segments pa daw yung right lung natin. Meanwhile, the left lung only has 2 lobes, okay? So on the next photo, makikita po natin yun. These illustrations right here shows us the lungs, their lobes, and the bronchi. Alright, so this one is the right lung, and this one is the left lung. Okay, so right here on top, the one that is seen to be a little bit pointed, no, yun po yung tinatawag na superior lobe. Alright, then let's move to the right lung. So, di ba sa right lung, meron daw siyang 3 lobes. Alright, so if this is the superior lobe, right here, it has what is known as the horizontal fissure dividing the middle lobe. So the middle or the second lobe is right here. Next, it has what is known as the oblique fissure. And then, this would show us that it, andito po sa side na ito, no, yung inferior lobe or yung lobe na nasa ibaba or mas malapit na sa base. Okay? So, ayan po. Again, superior lobe, middle lobe, and inferior lobe. Ito po yung components ng right lung natin. In comparison to the left lung only has 2 lobes. Alright? Wala siyang middle. Okay? It's just the superior and the inferior lobe. Alright? And as we can see right here, we have areas that are referred to as the cardiac impression, cardiac notch. Alright? So, ito po yung areas most likely kung saan nakaharap yung apex ng heart natin. Diba? If you would remember our discussion on the heart, diba po? The heart is located in the middle of our 2 lungs. Pero yung apex po ng heart, no, the apex of the heart is facing towards the left lung. Alright? Kaya po, mas nadedetect natin yung heartbeats ng isang pasyente by checking the left side of their chest. And ayun nga po, no, there are cardiac impressions and cardiac notches on the left lung to make space or to make way for the apex of the heart. Alright, so again, this is the structure of the right lung and left lung. Let's now talk about blood flow to the lungs. So oxygenated blood has passed through the lungs and picked up CO2. Okay, so again, definition of terms. Kapag sinabi natin na oxygenated na yung blood, alright, oxygenated blood means that nakadaan na po siya sa lungs. So, nakahingi na siya ng oxygen. On the other hand, no, kabaliktaran po nito is deoxygenated blood. So, kapag sinabing deoxygenated na po yung blood supply, no, it has already gone through the tissue. So, dumaan na siya sa systemic circulation natin. Dumaan na siya sa lahat ng iba't ibang tissues natin, and it has already released some of its oxygen content. So, basically, naipamigay na po niya yung oxygen na meron siya. So, it's now referred to as deoxygenated. Alright? So, ulitin natin. May oxygen pa, oxygenated. Wala ng oxygen, deoxygenated. Next, pulmonary capillaries would carry the deoxygenated blood to the pulmonary ulitin po natin yun. Pulmonary arteries. Alright? Pulmonary arteries would carry the deoxygenated blood to the pulmonary capillaries. Alright? So again, wag pong malilito. Yung pulmonary arteries, sila yung magdadala ng deoxygenated blood papunta sa pulmonary capillaries. After that, the blood would become oxygenated and return to the heart through the pulmonary veins. Alright? So again, if you would remember one of the illustrations that we've seen earlier, diba? Yung pulmonary capillaries po, these are the capillaries that are right next to our alveoli. Alright? So, nandito yung respiratory membrane where gas exchange would happen. Di ba po? So, ayun. That's what happens. Alright? So, pag dineliver na or pag dumaan na sa pulmonary arteries yung deoxygenated blood, no? Dadaan sa pulmonary arteries yung blood na ubos na yung oxygen supply, aabot po sila sa pulmonary capillaries. Pagdating sa pulmonary capillaries, mag-gas exchange sila, no? Ipamimigay nung blood yung carbon dioxide niya, tapos tatanggapin niya yung oxygen. After that, the blood would now become oxygenated again, and this would return to the heart by passing through the pulmonary veins. Let's now talk about the lymphatic supply to the lungs. All right, so first up is the superficial lymphatic vessels. So this surrounds each lung. All right, so basically nakapaligid lang daw po siya, no? Nakapaligid lang siya sa labas ng lungs. Meanwhile, the deep lymphatic vessels would follow the bronchi. Alright, so may mga lymphatic vessels din po tayo na sinusundan niya yung bronchi papasok doon sa lungs. Alright, so that's the difference between superficial and deep lymphatic vessels on the lungs. Let's now talk about pleural membranes and pleural cavities. Alright, so yung pleural cavity po, this is the space around each lung. Right? So again, ang keywords po natin dito, no, kapag sinabing cavity, this is a space. Alright? So, ayan po, tinawag siyang pleural cavity because this is a space specifically around each of our lungs. Next is the pleura. So the pleura, this is a double-layered membrane that surrounds the lungs. So there are two types of pleura. Okay? So first up is the parietal pleura. So the parietal pleura, this is the membrane that lines the thoracic cavity. Okay? So ito po yung parietal pleura, no? Naka-attach siya dun sa thoracic cavity. Let's compare that to the visceral pleura. The visceral pleura is a membrane that covers the lung's surface. So yung visceral pleura, alright, this is directly attached to the lungs. Alright? So ayun po, kapag sinabing parietal, yung surroundings yung kinakapitan or binabalutan niya. Kapag sinabing visceral, yung mismong organ yung binabalutan nitong membrane na to. So again, pag sinabing parietal pleura, this would line the thoracic cavity. Pero kapag sinabi po na visceral pleura, this would cover the surface of the lungs. This is directly attached on the surface of the lungs. This illustration right here shows us a superior view of our lungs. So if we were to look at this illustration right here, diba? If we were to make this cut right here on top, ang mangyayari po is, mavivisualize po natin yung lungs in this specific angle or in this specific view. Alright? So as we can see right here, imagine that the person is facing you. So yung likod niya, nandito, alright, andito yung vertebra, yung harap niya, nandito, kasi nandito yung sternum, alright? So, ayan po, magtatandaan yung locations ng parietal pleura, pleural cavity, and yung visceral pleura. So, yung parietal pleura, naka-attach siya or ang kino-cover niya is yung lining ng thoracic cavity. Yung pleural cavity, yun yung space sa pagitan nila. Tapos yung visceral pleura, this one is a membrane that is directly attached to the surface of the lungs. Let's now talk about the process of ventilation, or simply breathing. So this is the process of moving air in and out of the lungs. So ganun lang po kasimple, alright? Yung pagdaloy ng hangin as we inhale and yung pagdaloy ng hangin as we exhale, that's it. That's what we mean when we say ventilation. So there are two aspects of ventilation. This may be brought about by the action of the muscles of respiration. So yun nabanggit natin kanina na yung diaphragm and then the muscles within our thoracic cavity or thoracic wall, alright? Next, air pressure gradients. So ito po yung dalawang factors, no, that influence our ventilation or breathing. Listed here are the muscles of inspiration, otherwise referred to as inhalation. Alright, so ito daw po yung mga muscles na tumutulong sa atin na mag-inhale. All right, so this increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. So listed here are all the muscles that would help us inhale. The diaphragm, external intercostals, pectoralis minor, and scalene muscles. All right, so huwag pong kakalimutan, enumerated here are all the muscles that would help us inhale. Let's now talk about the muscles of expiration, or the muscles that would help us with exhalation. So these ones would decrease the thoracic volume by depressing the ribs and the sternum. Alright, so basically, kinocompress daw po ng mga muscles na to yung ribs and sternum natin, kind of like giving a squeezing motion to our lungs to help us exhale. Alright, so the internal intercostals, the transverse thoraces, and the abdominal muscles, these are the three muscles that are involved in expiration or exhalation. Alright, ulitin po natin, the muscles that are involved in exhalation would include the internal intercostals, transverse thoraces, and abdominal muscles. Let's now talk about quiet in comparison to labored breathing. So in quiet breathing, expiration or exhalation is a passive process. So pag sinabi natin passive, we don't have to consciously think about it anymore. We just breathe normally without attempting to control our rhythmic breathing. Diba po? So, ayan. Let's compare that to labored inspiration or labored expiration. All right, so in labored inspiration, more air moves into the lungs because the inspiratory muscles are more active. All right, so dito po mas nagtatrabaho daw po yung mga muscles natin that are involved in inhalation, kaya mas maraming air yung pumapasok sa ating lungs. Next is labored expiration or labored exhalation. So with this one, more air would move out of the lungs because of the forceful contraction of the internal intercostals and abdominal muscles. So dito po, in-specify nila yung dalawang muscles that is involved in labored exhalation. Alright? So again, mas maraming air yung lumalabas sa lungs natin because of the contraction of the internal intercostals and abdominal muscles. Inspiration or inhalation happens when the thoracic cavity volume increases. So basically, nag-expand or lumalaki daw po yung space ng thoracic cavity natin. Another thing that happens during inhalation or inspiration is the atmospheric pressure is greater compared to alveolar pressure. Alright? So, mas malakas daw po yung atmospheric pressure. Mas malakas yung puwersa ng pagpasok ng hangin sa lungs natin. Okay, so air moves into the alveoli. All right, so that's what happens during inspiration or inhalation. Next, expiration or exhalation happens when the diaphragm relaxes and the rib cage recoils. So what happens here is that the thoracic cavity volume decreases. Lumiliit daw po yung space ng thoracic cavity natin. So the thing that we would be able to observe here is that the alveolar pressure is greater compared to atmospheric pressure. So mas matindi daw po yung puwersa ng hangin na lumalabas galing sa alveoli natin compared sa hangin na pumapasok from the outside. So what would happen here is air would move out of the lungs. Alright, so again, that's what happens during expiration or exhalation. Alveolar ventilation is the measure of the volume of air that is available for gas exchange per minute. Now, we need to take note that there is an area within our lungs where no gas exchange would happen, and this is referred to as the dead space. Okay, ulitin po natin, may area or may place daw po no, sa lungs natin where no gas exchange happens, and that place is referred to as the dead space. Listed here are the different factors that affect our ventilation or breathing, right? So gender, age, body size, and physical fitness. Okay, so again, gender, age, body size, and physical fitness are the things that we could consider, or factors that we need to consider that would affect our breathing. All right, so emphasis on body size and physical fitness kasi itong dalawa po yung mas readily observable, no, among these four factors that would affect our breathing. Lung recoil is the tendency for an expanded lung to decrease in size. So basically, pag sinabi pong lung recoil, no, kapag katapos nating mag-inhale, mag-expand yung lungs, di ba? But after nating mag-inhale, kailangan niyang bumalik to its original size, right? So the expanded lung would decrease in size. And this happens during quiet expiration or quiet exhalation. Right? So lung recoil is brought about by the elastic fibers and the thin film of fluid lining our alveoli. So nagiging posible daw po ang lung recoil because of the elastic fibers and film of fluid that is lining our alveoli. Next, what are surfactants? Surfactants is a mixture of lipoproteins, all right, lipids and proteins. So this is produced by secretory cells of the alveoli, all right? So ano po ba ang mga surfactants? This is a fluid layer on the surface lining the alveoli, all right? So there's a small amount of fluid daw po, no, sa mga alveoli natin, and it reduces surface tension and keeps our lungs from collapsing. Alright, notice, diba, our lungs is basically a place that is filled with air sacs, alright? So, napakaraming spaces that's just filled up with air. So, bakit hindi ito basta-basta nagko-collapse or nade-deform, nag-i-squish, no? As time goes by or as we kind of like strain our lungs, all right? So again, this happens because of the presence of our surfactants, all right? So again, surfactants, they are made up of lipoproteins. They are produced by secretory cells of the alveoli, and they form a fluid layer that prevents the lungs from collapsing. Let's now talk about gas exchange in the lungs. So blood returning from the tissues and entering the alveoli in the lung has a lower partial pressure of oxygen. Okay, so ulitin natin yung statement na yun. Yung blood daw po galing sa tissues, deoxygenated na sila, diba? They don't have any more oxygen with them. So that means they have a lower partial pressure of oxygen kasi nga halos wala na silang oxygen na dala, and a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Right? So, oxygen diffuses from the alveoli, alright? So, mula daw sa alveoli, magde-diffuse or pupunta sa blood natin yung oxygen. And then, kabaliktaran nito, CO2 diffuses from the capillaries, okay? So, ililet go nung blood cells natin yung carbon dioxide na meron sila, and ipamimigay nila ito papunta sa alveoli para may exhale na natin. That was for the gas exchange in the lungs. Let's now talk about gas exchange in the tissues. So, blood traveling from the lungs, okay? So, yung blood nanggaling na daw po sa lungs. So, nakahingi na sila ng oxygen. Di ba po? They have a higher partial pressure of oxygen. Alright? So, mas mataas daw yung partial pressure of oxygen nila. Kasi nga po, di ba? May bit-bit na sila or may dala-dala na silang oxygen molecules, and they have a lower partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Kasi diba, what happened earlier in the lungs? Pinamigay na nila dun sa alveoli yung carbon dioxide that they were previously carrying. Okay? So oxygen diffuses from the capillaries into the interstitial fluid. So dito po, no, when there is gas exchange in the tissues, pagdating po sa mga specific tissues ng blood flow natin, no, ipamimigay na niya or i-diffuse na niya yung oxygen galing sa capillaries, and mapupunta na ito sa interstitial fluid. On the other hand, CO2 diffuses from the interstitial fluid into the blood in the capillaries. So, ang mangyayari, yung mga carbon dioxide daw po na na-produce ng mga cells and tissues natin, again, i-exchange talaga nila, no? Ipamimigay na nila ito doon sa blood na present sa capillaries natin para ma-deliver na ng blood natin pabalik sa lungs para ma-exhale na nung lungs natin yung carbon dioxide na yun. Let's now talk about respiratory membrane thickness. So increased thickness decreases rate of diffusion. All right. So one thing that we've already mentioned earlier, diba, is the structure of our alveoli and capillaries. All right, or yung respiratory membrane. So both of them, diba, they have simple endothelium. Okay, simple squamous endothelium. So, manipis na layer lang po ng cells para easy yung diffusion ng gases. Now, what happens here is that if, for example, a person is experiencing pulmonary edema, all right, pulmonary edema meaning there is accumulation of fluid in the lungs, this would decrease diffusion. Okay, so medyo babagal daw po yung pag-diffuse ng gases kapag may pulmonary edema ang isang person. So the rate of gas exchange is decreased. So oxygen exchange is affected before carbon dioxide because carbon dioxide diffuses more easily than oxygen. So kapag may pulmonary edema daw po ang isang pasyente, mas nagiging apektado or mas nauunang bumagal yung pag-diffuse ng oxygen kasi medyo mas mabilis daw pong i-diffuse or i-release ang carbon dioxide compared to oxygen. Let's now talk about hemoglobin. Now, if you've already watched our discussion on the human blood, review na lang po ito sa atin, diba? So hemoglobin, this is a protein that occupies about 1/3 of the total volume of the cytoplasm of red blood cells or RBCs. All right. So ayan po. Again, if you would remember the structure of RBCs, they are a biconcave disc with no nucleus, diba? So hindi na po kailangan ng mga RBCs ng nucleus. All right. So that entire area is now filled up with hemoglobin. So hemoglobin consists of 4 units, each containing one iron-based heme group which binds to oxygen. Okay? So ulitin natin, no, or reviewin natin kung ano yung structure ng hemoglobin. It is composed of 4 globin molecules, di ba? Tapos sa bawat globin molecule, may naka-attach na heme. Sa bawat heme molecule, meron naka-attach na iron. Alright? And dun sa iron molecule, doon po mag-a-attach yung oxygen. Doon magbabind yung oxygen para mabitbit ito ng red blood cells. Right? So, ayan po. Let's now talk about the regulation of ventilation or regulation of breathing. So the respiratory rate or breathing rate is regulated to maintain gas concentrations. Alright? So hindi daw po mabuti na sobra yung pag-inhale natin, hindi naman mabuti na sobra yung pag-exhale natin. So of course, our breathing needs to be regulated. So there are neurons in our medulla oblongata that control the rate of ventilation through stimulation of the muscles of respiration. Alright? So, ulitin po natin yung part na yun. Sa medulla oblongata natin, no? At our brain, no? There are neurons within our medulla oblongata kung saan inuutusan po nila or kinokontrol nila yung mga muscles of respiration. So, kinokontrol nila yung mga muscles that is involved in inhalation and the muscles that is involved in exhalation. So, again, this happens in the medulla oblongata. Let's talk more about that medullary respiratory center. All right, so again, the medullary respiratory center is located at our medulla oblongata, and it has 2 components, all right? The dorsal respiratory group, or DRG, and the ventral respiratory group, or VRG. Okay, so yung dorsal respiratory group na po, this is most active during inspiration. Okay, so mostly kapag nag-i-inhale tayo, ang nagtatrabaho po dito is yung dorsal respiratory group. Meanwhile, yung ventral respiratory group naman po, this is active during inspiration and expiration. So, both for inhaling and exhaling, ang nagtatrabaho dito is yung ventral respiratory group. Another thing about the ventral respiratory group is that it contains the pre-Bötzinger complex, which is believed to establish the basic rhythm of respiration. Alright, so yung constant na rhythm ng pag-inhale, exhale natin, no, na-establish daw ito ng pre-Bötzinger complex. What is the pre-Bötzinger complex anyway? Ano po ito? The pre-Bötzinger complex or pre-BOTC is a neural network that is responsible for inspiration during respiratory activity. So yung part daw po ng VRG, no, that is involved in inspiration or inhalation, isa ito sa mga bagay na kumbaga is parang may control yung pre-BOTC. Alright? So, in 1991, medyo recent pa po ito, no? In 1991, the pre-BOTC was described as a region of the ventral medulla oblongata containing the neural pathway that is necessary to generate respiratory rhythm. Alright? So, ulitin po natin yon kung na-confuse kayo sa statement na yon. Noong 1991, no, na-discover nila yung pre-BOTC or yung pre-Bötzinger complex. So, ito daw po yung part dun sa ventral area ng medulla oblongata na, ayun nga po, they have been able to find out that this is the part of our brain that is responsible for creating our respiratory rhythm or yung rhythmic na pag-inhale, exhale natin. This slide right here shows us the location of our medullary respiratory center, alright, which is right here. And then, tinuturo po nito sa atin, no, kung saan yung mga specific muscles or specific areas na iniimpluwensyahan ng medullary respiratory center natin to help us with inhalation and exhalation. Let's now talk about the generation of rhythmic ventilation. Alright, so paano daw po nakikreate yung rhythm ng pag-breathe in and breathe out natin. First up, we would have the starting inspiration. So the medullary respiratory center establishes the basic rhythm of ventilation. Alright, so this would receive stimulation from the receptors for blood gas levels. So kung halimbawa, konti na lang ba yung oxygen levels, masyado bang mataas yung carbon dioxide levels, those types of things. Alright, another thing that they would be considering is blood temperature. Next is the movements of our muscles and joints. So, syempre, the movements of our muscles and joints, they would require energy, diba? And energy would be created, no, with the help of the oxygen supply, right? So ayan po, again, movements of muscles and joints that also affects, no, that would also affect our starting inspiration, and of course emotions. So there are people out there that when they're experiencing certain emotions, their breathing also changes. So example, kapag kinakabahan yung isang tao, di ba minsan kapag kinakabahan yung isang tao, lumalalim yung paghinga nila. Another thing would be if a person is experiencing a panic attack. Now, for some people experiencing a panic attack, maaari po na bumilis naman yung breathing rate nila. Diba? So, ayan po. Emotions could also affect our starting inspiration. Now, input from receptors causes action potentials that stimulate the respiratory muscles. So, basically, kapag itong mga factors na to, blood gas levels, movement, emotions, no, kapag ito po ay na-process na ng medullary respiratory center, magsisimula na po itong mag-send ng action potentials sa mga respiratory muscles natin. Second step is the increasing inspiration. So once inspiration begins, more and more neurons are activated. Alright? So kapag nagsimula na daw po, no, yung pag-inhale natin, basically, para magsisimula na rin po or may encourage na rin na magtrabaho yung ibang mga neurons ng medullary respiratory center natin, no, to progressively create a stronger stimulation of the respiratory muscles. Third one is the stopping inspiration. So neurons stimulating the muscles of respiration could also stimulate neurons that are responsible for stopping inspiration. So ayun po, again, they're attempting to achieve some form of homeostasis or balance, diba? Hindi naman po pwede na patuloy lang, no? Patuloy lang yung pag-inhale ng isang person. So they would also kind of like do something for stopping inspiration. Alright, so inhibitory neurons inhibits respiratory muscles and relax those respiratory muscles. Let's now talk about the factors that affect respiratory rate. First up, when there is decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen, this would be observed in cases of hypoxia. This causes an increase in respiratory rate. All right, so again, no, kapag mababa yung partial pressure ng oxygen, no, our body would attempt to increase this by also increasing the respiratory rate or yung paghinga ng isang pasyente. Next, if there is an increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which is otherwise referred to as hypercapnia, this also causes an increase in the rate and depth of ventilation. Rate and depth, so yung dalas, no, yung number of inhale, exhale ng isang person, no, per minute, dadami daw po ito. And as well as the depth of ventilation or kung gaano kalalim yung pag-inhale and pag-exhale ng isang pasyente. Alright, again, this happens in cases of hypercapnia or excessive yung partial pressure ng carbon dioxide. Next, if there is a decrease in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, kabaliktaran nito, this would be referred to as hypocapnia. So this causes a decrease in ventilation. So medyo magi-slow down po, no, yung breathing rate natin kasi masyado ng maraming carbon dioxide yung ine-exhale natin. Next, chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata and the blood vessels near the heart would respond to the changes in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and also the blood pH. Alright, so ulitin natin, no, located within our medulla oblongata and also located within the blood vessels near our heart, meron daw po tayong chemoreceptors. Alright, so these are sensory receptors that would detect if there is any change in the partial pressures of carbon dioxide or yung pH ng blood natin. Kasi po, yung increase or decrease ng carbon dioxide in our blood, that also affects our blood pH. Alright, so ayan po. These are the factors affecting respiratory rate. Next, we have what is known as the Herring-Brewer reflex. So the Herring-Brewer reflex would limit the depth of inhalation, preventing the overinflation of the lungs. So yung dahilan daw po kung bakit hindi sumusobra yung pag-inflate ng lungs natin, no? Yung dahilan daw po kung bakit hindi palaging sobrang lalim ng paghinga natin ay dahil sa Herring-Brewer reflex. Again, this would limit the depth or yung lalim ng paghinga natin and also preventing yung overinflation or sobrang pag-expand ng ating lungs. Again, that is because of the Herring-Brewer reflex. This slide right here shows us a visual representation of the nervous and chemical mechanisms of breathing. Alright, so again, a lot of these things happen within our medulla oblongata or yung medullary respiratory center. So, pinapakita lang naman po dito yung iba't ibang mga scenarios and yung iba't ibang mga organs natin that is involved and that may be able to influence our breathing. If you belong to my lecture classes, that ends our discussion on the respiratory system. Thank you so much for listening. If you belong to my laboratory classes, let's now proceed and go through the microscopic anatomy samples that we may be able to observe with regards to the observation of our respiratory system. This slide right here shows us a microscopic view of our nasal cavity. Alright? So, yung mismong nasal cavity natin, ito po yung nakikita nating spaces dito or yung white or blank areas. Alright? The nasal septum, ito po yung naghahati. No? Ito yung magde-divide between the two external nares or yung dalawang butas po ng ilong. Alright? Other things that we may be able to see here is the oral cavity. So right here, ito yung space ng oral cavity, and then this organ right here is the tongue. This slide right here shows us 3 different views of our larynx. Now, if you would remember from the previous discussion, the larynx is otherwise referred to as the voice box, alright? So, ayan po. Kaya dito sa isang view, nakakakita tayo ng false vocal folds, and nandito po yung true vocal cords, alright? Now, with regards to viewing these samples in scanner mode, it's a bit difficult to actually kind of like identify everything. So, it makes a bit more sense, no? Medyo mas may sense po na yung medyo mas zoomed in na view yung tinitignan natin. So, for this one, focus po tayo dito sa low power objective. So, here at the low power objective, makikita po natin no, na simula pa lang sa larynx, we may be able to see that this is already lined with pseudo-stratified columnar epithelium, as we can see right here. And it's also ciliated, diba? If you would look at this outer edge right here. Alright? So, ayan po. Again, no, pseudo-stratified columnar cells. They're not actually stratified. Mukha lang silang multiple layers kasi hindi sila pantay-pantay ng height or hindi magkakapantay yung levels or locations ng nucleus nila, 'di ba? But if you would see the basement membrane right here, no, lahat naman sila ay naka-attach sa basement membrane. Right here, we may also be able to observe goblet cells or these white spots right here, no? Goblet cells, they may be able to produce mucus, right? They can secrete mucus. Still on the larynx, itong mga views naman po na ito ay nakafocus na doon sa mismong vocal cords natin. Alright? So again, our vocal cords, no, they're capable of producing sound as air passes through them. So when air passes through them, they would vibrate, creating the sound that we are hearing when we speak. Alright? So as we can see right here, kapag may nakikita kayong ganitong itsura, no, this is the vocalis muscle area. Alright? These areas right here are just ligaments. Next, ayan, here's another view showing a tiny segment of the vocalis muscle. And then dito sa labas, ma-observe na ulit natin yung usual na respiratory epithelium. Again, ano po ang component ng respiratory epithelium? Pseudostratified columnar epithelium, or buuhin natin, no, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. This slide shows us a sample of the trachea at low power objective. Now again, what is the trachea made of? It's made of letter C-shaped cartilages, diba? C-shaped rings of cartilage. So ito po yung nakikita natin dito. Notice, this strip of cartilage is lightly curved, alright? So ayan po. Again, on this outer portion right here, we would be able to observe the respiratory epithelium. Again, ano ang composition ng respiratory epithelium? Pseudostratified, ciliated, columnar cells. These kind of like things right here that look like holes, these are blood vessels, all right? So these are the blood vessels that would supply oxygen and nutrients to our trachea. And then these areas right here, no, this is the hyaline cartilage. All right, so wag pong kakalimutan, no, our trachea is made up of C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage. This slide right here shows us an example of the trachea in high power objective. So right here, we're seeing in more detail yung hyaline cartilage po natin. And right here, mas nakikita na po natin, no, yung pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Again, these empty spaces or holes right here, these are most likely our blood vessels. Alright, so I guess by now, no, dapat medyo familiar na tayo sa appearance ng hyaline cartilage and ng pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Kasi po, di ba, hindi na ito bago sa paningin natin. We've already talked about this when we discussed tissues and histology, right? So dito po, we're just learning that these two things together, hyaline cartilage and pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, together they would create our trachea. This slide right here shows us an example of the trachea in oil immersion objective view. Okay? So, ayan po. Dito kitang-kita na talaga natin, no, yung bawat isa dun sa mga pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And as we can see right here, no, naka-point out din kung nasan yung area where we would be seeing their cilia or their hair-like structures. Alright? Next, since nasa oil immersion objective na tayo, medyo mas nakikita na natin yung connective tissue components. So these connective tissue components are otherwise referred to as the lamina propria. Next, again, nakita na natin sa previous slides, no, these empty spaces right here are most likely blood vessels. This slide right here shows us an example of the bronchiole and the alveoli in scanner view. Okay, so if for example, this is the bronchiole and right here is a tiny artery or an arteriole, tuloy-tuloy na po ito or magba-branch out na ito papunta sa respiratory duct. Alright, so when it reaches the respiratory duct, dun na po magsisimula na makakakita tayo ng multiple clusters of alveoli. Again, our alveoli is otherwise referred to as air sacs, diba? So there's not a lot of things that we're seeing right here. There's so much empty spaces. Kasi nga po, no, these are areas wherein air would pass through. Let's look at this low power view of the bronchiole and alveoli. So, ganun din naman po, no? The bronchiole lumen is usually larger, alright? Mas malaki yung space sa gitna ng bronchiole. Kasi nga, di ba, parang it's one of the larger branches, no? And then after that, it branches off further into the alveoli. So, nakikita natin dito yung simple epithelium and the alveolar air spaces. Right here, we're also seeing an arterial lumen. So usually, no, magkalapit or magkatabi po yung mga bronchioles and arterioles. This slide right here shows us the bronchiole and alveoli in high power objective. So ayan po. As you can see right here, if this is the bronchiole lumen, all right, this is the bronchiolar epithelium. Now, if we were to compare the bronchiolar epithelium compared sa alveolar epithelium, no? Ayan po. The bronchiolar epithelium is made up of a single layer of cuboidal cells, diba? Simple cuboidal epithelium. Look at these cells right here. They're not squamous, diba? They're definitely not columnar, so they are cuboidal. Pero, yung mga alveoli po, no, they're made up of simple squamous epithelium. Bakit ganun? Bakit magkaiba po sila? Because at the alveoli, that's where gas exchange would happen. Di ba po? So it makes sense, no? It makes perfect sense na mas manipis yung type of cell na pwede nating makita sa paligid ng mga alveoli in comparison to the bronchiolar epithelium. Right here, it's a bit difficult to see some of the simple squamous epithelium of our alveoli kasi po we're seeing right here no na katabi nila yung capillaries no, capillaries in the alveolar walls, and maraming naka-attach na mga RBCs or maraming mga RBCs na malapit sa area na to. So parang natatambakan ng mga RBCs yung ibang structures that we're supposed to be observing. Alright? But anyway, ayan po, kapag nakakita kayo ng ganito, no, most likely these are RBCs, meaning that capillaries are nearby. This slide right here shows us an oil immersion objective view of our bronchus. Alright? So one of our bronchi. So ayun po, ganun din naman yung composition niya. Alright? So it's still composed of that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Right here, naka-point out yung specific areas kung nasaan yung cilia. And then right here, may pinapakita din po na goblet cell. The goblet cell right here is a bit lighter staining, no? Mas light yung stain niya compared to all the other cells around it. Again, goblet cells are there to produce mucus. Alright, right here is kind of like a layer of connective tissue, and right here, no, ito po ay yung mga smooth muscles na, no, smooth muscles that would surround the bronchus. And again, smooth muscles are there to help us with either bronchodilation or bronchoconstriction. Kapag bronchodilation, mag-i-increase yung diameter ng bronchus. Kapag bronchoconstriction, no, magko-constrict or liliit yung diameter ng bronchus, so liliit din yung daanan ng hangin. Again, which medical condition leads to the bronchoconstriction of the terminal bronchioles? It's asthma. Alright, so pag hinihika yung mga tao, nagkakaroon din sila ng episode of bronchoconstriction. This slide right here shows us an example of the bronchus with cartilage at high power objective. So again, same respiratory epithelium. It's made up of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Guys, kapag itong mga bagay na to ay minali nyo pa sa mga upcoming practicals and sa upcoming mga major exams, no? Medyo nakakaya kasi paulit-ulit ko na pong sinasabi ano ang composition ng respiratory epithelium. It's pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Isa pa, ulitin natin, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Pag yan talaga nakalimutan nyo pa ha. And then right here, we're seeing no a bit of cartilage. All right, so again, anong type of cartilage would create some areas of our respiratory tract? It's hyaline cartilage. All right, so again, ulitin natin, yung mga cartilage na pwede nating ma-observe sa ating respiratory tract is made up of hyaline cartilage. This slide right here shows us an example of the alveoli in low power objective. Okay, so dito po, ayan, medyo mas nakikita na natin, no, yung simple squamous epithelium, no, simple squamous epithelium that would create each of our alveolus, or creating all of the alveoli that we're seeing right here. So all of these empty spaces are the air spaces, okay? This slide right here shows us an example of the alveoli in high power objective with alveolar macrophages. So as we can see right here, wala pong nakadikit sa kanila na mga RBCs, alright? So mas nakikita na po natin yung simple squamous epithelium ng alveoli natin, alright? So these are just a single layer of squamous cells. And again, bakit kailangan single layer of squamous cells lang ang composition ng alveoli? Because this is where gas exchange would happen. So we need a kind of like an epithelium where it could facilitate an easy diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So again, saan gawa? No? Saan gawa ang alveoli natin? Sa simple squamous epithelium. All right, and then these ones right here, no, nakikita natin, these are the alveolar macrophages. So they're present, no, they're present in our alveoli just in case halimbawa meron tayong ma-inhale na infectious pathogens, all right? If there may be infectious pathogens out there such as bacteria or fungi, no, na na-acquire natin sila via inhalation, alright? So, minsan, no, hindi sila natatrap sa hairs ng external nares natin. Minsan, hindi sila natatrap sa mucus, no, nakakalusot pa sila sa mucous membranes ng nasal cavity natin. So, at least, kapag umabot po sila, no, kapag umabot sila sa alveoli natin, at least, no, may next line of defense pa tayo, which is our alveolar macrophages. Now, if you would remember our discussion on the human blood, right, yung mga macrophages po, they are phagocytes, diba? They are phagocytic cells. They are capable of phagocytizing or engulfing, no, yung mga foreign substances and infectious microbial pathogens. All right, so again, that's the purpose of the alveolar macrophages being inside of our alveoli. That ends our discussion on the respiratory system. I am Aurel Enriquez. Thank you so much for listening.